The smell of charcoal and scorched paper filled the cramped apartment. Alisha stood over the metal trash can, her knuckles white as she gripped the edges of the ultrasound photo. Her hands shook, a tremor that traveled from her fingers up to her shoulders. She looked at the image one last time, the only proof of a life that was never meant to be. She held it over the glowing embers. The heat rose, stinging her face, but she did not pull away. She let go. The paper hit the fire, curled instantly, and turned black. She watched the edges dissolve into gray flakes that drifted upward in the stagnant air. Her breath hitched, a sharp sound in the quiet room. She wiped her face, but the tears kept coming, tracking through the dust on her skin. She had spent months translating the words of others, building a life in a city that did not know her name. Now, she was erasing the only thing that made her feel anchored. The fire dimmed, leaving behind nothing but a pile of cold, dark remains. She stared at the bin, her chest tight, waiting for the silence to stop ringing in her ears. The choice was made. There was no going back. She turned away from the bin, her legs feeling heavy as she moved toward the window. Outside, the city of Seoul stretched toward the horizon, a sprawling grid of neon and movement that did not know she existed. Below, the streets were a river of headlights, a constant, rhythmic pulse of traffic that hummed against the glass. People were rushing home, grabbing late dinners, and living lives that were entirely untouched by the fire she had just set. The sound of the city was a low, steady roar, a mechanical heartbeat that mocked the stillness of her apartment. She pressed her forehead against the cool pane, watching the rain begin to streak the glass. Every light in the distance represented 1,000 stories, yet none of them intersected with the void she now felt. The indifference of the skyline was absolute. She was a ghost in a machine that never stopped to mourn. The city was alive, vibrant, and utterly unaware of the ashes cooling in the room behind her. The memory of her arrival felt like a different lifetime. She remembered the humidity of the airport terminal, the sharp, unfamiliar scent of the city, and the weight of her luggage as she stepped out into the bustling streets. She had come to Seoul with nothing but a degree, a handful of contacts, and a desperate need to build something of her own. The first few weeks were a blur of neon signs and late-night study sessions. Welcome to Seoul Love Stories. If you're just joining, kindly subscribe, learning the rhythm of a language that felt like a puzzle she was determined to solve. She found work as a translator, a role that demanded absolute precision and a sharp ear for the nuances of every conversation. She thrived on the challenge, spending hours in quiet cafes, her notebook filled with scribbled phrases and complex technical terms. She was a woman on a mission, navigating the labyrinth of the city with a focus that left no room for doubt. Every street corner was a new possibility, every interaction a chance to prove her worth. She moved through the crowded subway stations and the glass-fronted office buildings with a sense of purpose that felt indestructible. She was building a foundation, brick by brick, word by word, convinced that her dedication would be enough. High above the frantic pulse of the city, the atmosphere shifted into something colder, more calculated. The headquarters of Kang Industries occupied the top floors of a glass monolith, a space where silence was a commodity. Inside, the corridors were lined with polished stone and muted lighting, designed to intimidate anyone who dared to walk them. The office itself was a cavern of glass and steel, offering a panoramic view of Seoul that made the rest of the world look like a miniature model. At the center of this domain sat Kang Min-ho. He operated with a singular, relentless focus, his gaze fixed on the digital monitors. His authority was absolute, rooted in a reputation for navigating the most volatile negotiations with a lethal, unwavering calm. He spent his days dissecting contracts and dismantling competition, his movements as precise as the clock on his wall. He was the architect of this empire, a man who viewed the world through the lens of leverage and control. The boardroom doors clicked shut, sealing them into a space defined by polished wood and the low hum of ventilation. Alisha took her seat at the far end of the table, her notebook open, pen poised. She was there to bridge the gap between two worlds, translating the rapid-fire technical jargon of international trade into something actionable. Across the table, Kang Min-ho sat perfectly still. He spoke in short, clipped sentences that stripped away any room for negotiation. Alisha kept her eyes on her notes, her voice steady as she relayed his demands, ensuring every nuance of his intent was captured with absolute accuracy. The air in the room grew heavy with the friction of opposing interests. At one point, the lead negotiator for the opposing firm challenged a clause, and the room went deathly quiet. Minho leaned forward, his gaze locking onto hers as he waited for her to translate the rebuttal. She felt the weight of his focus. She delivered the translation without a tremor, her tone as clinical as his own. For a fleeting second, the professional mask slipped. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the Seoul skyline into a blurred watercolor of gray and neon. Inside, the office remained a sanctuary of silence, save for the rhythmic tapping of droplets against the glass. Alisha stood by the desk, waiting for the final set of documents to be processed. The air felt heavy, saturated with the dampness. Minho reached for the stack of files, his movements mechanical and swift. He extended his hand, and Alisha met him halfway. As she took the papers, his fingers brushed against the back of her hand. The contact was brief, yet it sent a jolt of static through the space. She froze. He did not pull away immediately. The professional distance that had defined their interactions for weeks evaporated. She looked up, expecting the usual cold, calculating stare, but found something else, a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. The sterile barrier was gone, replaced by a silence that felt heavy, electric, and entirely new. The office was a cage of glass and expectations, so they found the shadows of Itaewon. It began with a text, a simple location pin sent after the sun had already dipped behind the mountains. Alisha navigated the narrow, winding alleys, the air thick with the scent of grilled meat and damp pavement. She found him waiting in the corner of a dimly lit restaurant, tucked away from the main thoroughfare. As she approached, he stood, but the rigid posture he maintained in the boardroom was gone. They ordered in silence, the clatter of the city outside fading into the background. Here, the mask he wore for the world simply fell away. He spoke not of quarterly reports or market shares, but of the weight of the life he had built and the exhaustion of maintaining it. Alisha listened, her own guard lowering as she shared the quiet struggles of her first months in a city that felt like a foreign language. The city of Seoul moved at a relentless pace, but Alisha found herself lagging behind. Her apartment, once a place of quiet focus, now felt like a waiting room. She caught herself checking her phone every few minutes, the screen glowing in the dark, waiting for a signal that he was near. It was a dangerous shift. She had come here to build a foundation, to be the sharp, precise translator who needed nothing from anyone. Now, her entire world had narrowed down to the space between two people. She walked through the crowded subway stations, yet she felt entirely untethered. Every street corner, every neon sign, every crowded market stall now served as a backdrop for memories of him. She was no longer just a visitor in a new city. She was a woman who had handed over the keys to her own peace of mind. She knew the risk relying on a man like him was a gamble she could not afford to lose. She was fully, terrifyingly invested. The lobby of the corporate tower was a cathedral of marble and polished glass. Alisha walked toward the elevator bank, her mind occupied by the translation notes for the morning session. The air was cool and smelled of expensive floor wax. She reached for her access card, but a sudden ripple of movement through the lobby stopped her. People were slowing down, turning their heads toward the massive digital displays mounted above the security desk. She followed their gaze. The stock ticker vanished, replaced by a high-resolution image of a gala event. Then, the bold text slashed across the frame. It was a formal announcement. Kang Min-ho to marry the daughter of Daesung Group. The words hit the room like a physical blow. Alisha felt the hum of the building fade into a dull, distant roar. She stood frozen, the access card slipping from her fingers, to clatter against the stone floor. The future she had been building in the quiet corners of the city collapsed in a single, silent instant. The lobby air turned frigid. Alisha watched the screen for one final heartbeat, then turned away. She did not scream. She did not demand an explanation from the security guards or the bustling crowd. She simply walked toward the exit, her pace steady, her eyes fixed on the pavement outside. The city traffic was a blur of motion, but she moved through it with a singular, hollow purpose. She reached her apartment building and climbed the stairs, the heavy metal door clicking shut behind her. She sat at her desk, the laptop screen casting a pale, sterile light across her face. Her hands did not tremble. She typed the resignation, her fingers moving with a precision that felt alien. She clicked send. She stood up, walked to the window, and looked out. She was alone, the silence of the room pressing against her. The apartment felt smaller than it had an hour ago. Alisha paced the floor, her footsteps muffled by the thin rug. The the silence of the room now heavy with the weight of her departure. She moved to her bag, intending to clear out the remaining files, but her hand brushed against something cool and rectangular tucked deep in the side pocket. She pulled it out. It was a small, folded envelope. She opened it, her breath hitching as the image came into focus. The grainy, grayscale shapes were unmistakable. A heartbeat, a beginning, a life that existed entirely outside the reach of corporate scandals or public announcements. She sat on the edge of the bed, the paper trembling in her grip. This was not just a memory of a night in Itaewon. It was the only proof that their connection had been real. She traced the edge of the image with her thumb, the reality of her situation settling into her bones. She was carrying the only truth left between them. The ultrasound photo sat on the bedside table, a stark white rectangle against the dark wood. Alisha stared at it until the edges blurred into the shadows of the room. Every time she looked at those grainy lines, the pain of the betrayal sharpened, cutting through her resolve like a blade. She realized that as long as this image existed, the memory of him would remain anchored in her chest, refusing to fade. She stood up, her movements mechanical and stiff. She walked to the kitchen counter, her eyes fixed on the small metal bin she kept for refuse. The air in the apartment felt stagnant, thick with the scent of dust and unwashed dishes. She reached into a drawer, her fingers closing around a box of matches. The scratch of the phosphorus against the striker sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. A small, flickering flame bloomed, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. She held the photo over the metal bin, her hand hovering just inches above the growing heat. She told herself that burning the paper would finally sever the connection, that the smoke would carry away the ghost of their time together. She braced her knuckles, took a steadying breath, and lowered the corner of the paper into the fire. The flame caught the edge of the paper instantly. Alisha watched as the white surface turned to a charred, brittle black, the image of the heartbeat curling inward, as if trying to shield itself from the heat. She did not pull her hand away. She held it steady, watching the fire consume the only proof of what had been. The smell of burning paper filled the small space, sharp and acrid, stinging her nostrils. She felt the heat radiating against her palms, a dry, biting warmth that seemed to draw the moisture from her skin. As the paper disintegrated, flakes of gray ash drifted downward, landing like snow against the cold metal of the bin. She released her grip, and the final fragment dropped into the embers. It settled into the pile, crumbling into fine, unrecognizable dust. A sudden, hollow silence followed the crackle of the fire. She stood motionless, her hands still trembling, waiting for the weight in her chest to vanish with the smoke. It did not disappear, but it shifted. Miles away, the glass walls of the office tower offered no comfort. Minho slammed his palm against the mahogany surface of his desk, the sound echoing through the sterile, empty floor. He did not wait for his assistant. He grabbed his keys and bolted for the private elevator, his movements jagged and uncoordinated. Down in the lobby, the automatic doors slid open to reveal a city drowning in a torrential downpour. He sprinted toward the curb, but the streets were a gridlock of stalled taxis and flashing brake lights. The rain hammered against the pavement, turning the asphalt into a slick, treacherous river. He shouted for his driver, but the man was trapped 3 blocks back. Minho did not hesitate. He stepped out into the deluge, the cold water soaking through his layers instantly. He began to run. He ignored the stinging spray hitting his face and the way his lungs burned with every jagged breath. He wove between stalled vehicles, his eyes locked on the distant, flickering lights of the residential district. Every second felt like an hour. He knew what she was doing. He could feel the finality of her decision pulling at the air between them. The stairwell door swung open with a violent metallic clang. Minho stumbled into the dim hallway, his chest heaving in ragged, painful gasps. Water pooled around his feet, dripping steadily from his frame onto the worn linoleum floor. He leaned heavily against the wall, his palms sliding against the cold, peeling paint. Every muscle in his legs burned from the climb, and his vision blurred at the edges. He forced himself to stand upright, though his balance wavered. He reached out, his fingers trembling as he traced the numbers on the apartment doors. He stopped at the one he knew. He stood there for a heartbeat, his breath hitching in his throat, listening to the absolute form stillness behind the wood. The air in the hallway felt stagnant, heavy with the scent of damp concrete and the low hum of the building's ventilation. He wiped the rain from his eyes. He had run until his lungs felt like they were filled with glass. And now, standing just inches from the threshold, the reality of his situation settled in. He looked down at his hands, watching them shake, then clenched them into tight fists. He took one final, shaky breath, preparing to break the silence. He raised his right hand, hovering for a split second before the first blow landed. The sound was sharp, a dull thud that vibrated through the frame and into the floorboards. He did not wait for a response. He struck again, harder this time, his knuckles stinging with each impact. The noise echoed down the narrow corridor, bouncing off the concrete walls like a frantic, irregular heartbeat. He shifted his weight, driving his shoulder slightly into the wood. As he hammered his fist against the panel, he needed to be heard. He needed to break the barrier that separated him from the room. The rhythm was relentless, a steady, punishing cadence that demanded an answer. He paused, his ear pressed against the door, listening for any sign of movement from within, but there was only the hollow silence. He pulled back and hit the wood again, the force of the blow causing the door to shudder. He kept pounding, his breathing ragged, until the silence finally broke. The pounding ceased abruptly. For a long second, the hallway was deathly quiet, save for the ragged intake of his breath. Then, the internal lock clicked. The door swung inward, moving slowly on its hinges. Alisha stood in the gap, her frame silhouetted against the dim, amber light of the apartment. She did not speak. She did not move. He stood frozen, his hands still raised, his knuckles raw and throbbing from the impact. The frantic energy that had propelled him through the city vanished, replaced by a sudden, hollow ache. He stared at her, his vision struggling to focus in the transition from the dark hallway to the interior. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out, his posture slumped, his gaze wide and searching. Every line of his face was etched with a desperate, frantic intensity that bordered on collapse. She held her ground, her eyes fixed on him, reflecting a depth of exhaustion that mirrored his own. The air between them felt thin, charged with the weight of everything left unsaid. He did not wait for an invitation. He stepped over the threshold, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He pushed past her, his shoulder brushing the doorframe as he entered the small, cramped space. The air inside was thick, heavy with the sharp, acrid scent of charcoal and burnt paper. He ignored her presence entirely, his head snapping from side to side, his eyes darting across the room. He scanned the floor, the small table, the unmade bed, searching for something he could not name. His breathing was shallow, a series of quick, jagged gasps that filled the quiet apartment. Then, his movement stopped, his head tilted, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the corner near the window. There, sitting on the floor, was a metal trash bin. A thin wisp of gray smoke curled upward from the rim. He moved toward the bin with a slow, mechanical gait, as if the floor beneath him had turned to glass. Every step was deliberate, his eyes never leaving the pulsing embers. He reached the metal container and sank to his knees, the hard floor biting into his skin, but he did not seem to notice. His hands hovered over the rim, fingers twitching in the stagnant air. He hesitated, his breath hitching as he stared at the gray, curled flakes that had once held a future. Slowly, he lowered his hand into the bin. The heat radiated against his palm, dry and biting. He reached into the center, his fingers brushing the fragile, blackened edges of the paper. They crumbled instantly at his touch, turning into fine, dark dust that coated his skin. He pulled his hand back, staring at the soot staining his fingertips. The reality of the destruction settled into the room, heavier than the smoke. He did not look up at her. He remained on his knees, his shoulders hunched, his gaze locked on the ruin he had caused. The silence in the apartment deepened, punctuated only by the faint, dying crackle of the last ember. He remained motionless, his knees pressed hard into the floorboards. The soot from the bin streaked his palms, dark lines against his skin. He tried to speak, but his throat constricted, turning the attempt into a dry, jagged rasp. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he fought to regain control over his own body. The air in the apartment felt thin, recycled, and stagnant. He leaned forward, his forehead nearly touching the rim of the metal container, and closed his eyes. The smell of burnt paper clung to his breath. When he finally forced the words out, they were barely audible, a low vibration that barely traveled across the small space. "The baby is mine." The sentence hung in the air, suspended between them like a physical weight. His voice cracked mid-syllable, the sound raw and unpolished. He did not move to stand. He stayed there, hunched over the debris, his chest rising and falling in short, uneven bursts. The confession echoed against the walls, stripped of any corporate pretense or rehearsed formality. It was a simple, brutal admission that shattered the silence of the room. Alisha recoiled as if the words had been a physical blow. She took a sharp, jagged step backward, her heel catching on the edge of the rug. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, uneven rhythm that she could feel pulsing in her throat. She pressed her palms flat against the wall behind her, seeking the cold, unyielding stability of the plaster to keep herself upright. Her breath came in short, shallow hitches, burning as it passed through her chest. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the moisture spilled over, tracking hot, stinging lines down her face. She bit the inside of her lip, hard enough to taste the metallic tang of blood, forcing herself to focus on the sensation to ground her spinning thoughts. Every muscle in her body was locked, vibrating with the effort of holding back a scream. She felt the tremor start in her knees and travel upward. She did not look at him. She stared at the floor, watching the dust motes dance in the sliver of light from the window, waiting for her voice to return. She pushed herself away from the wall, her movements stiff and deliberate. The floorboards creaked under her weight, a sharp sound in the quiet room. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, smearing the salt and moisture, and finally forced her gaze toward him. He was still kneeling, a broken figure amidst the ashes of her past. She took a breath, pulling it deep into her lungs to steady the tremor in her diaphragm. "It does not matter," she said. The words were clipped, stripped of any inflection that might betray the ache in her chest. She kept her distance, her feet planted firmly to prevent her from swaying. "You are engaged." She repeated the fact like a mantra, a jagged piece of reality she held up between them to block his path. She watched his reaction, her own heart still slamming against her ribs with every beat. She refused to let the tears define this moment. She drew her shoulders back, locking her posture into a rigid line. "The news is everywhere," she continued, her voice gaining a brittle, hollow strength. "You have a future already chosen for you. Do not pretend that anything here changes that." Minho did not wait for her to finish. He surged upward, the sudden movement causing the floorboards to groan under his weight. He crossed the narrow space between them in 2 long strides, invading the perimeter she had tried so hard to maintain. Before she could retreat, his hands clamped onto her shoulders. The grip was firm, anchoring her in place, forcing her to stop her backward drift. He did not shake her, he held her steady, his fingers digging into the muscle. He leaned in, his face inches from hers, compelling her to look directly into his eyes. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice raw and stripped of its usual professional veneer. He ignored her attempt to use the engagement as a shield. "That engagement is a contract," he insisted, his tone hardening with a sudden, fierce conviction. "It is a lie, and I am finished with lies." He held her there, his eyes searching hers for a flicker of recognition, refusing to let her look away. The air in the room grew heavy. He felt her muscles tense under his palms, but he did not loosen his hold. He needed her to hear the truth before she could pull away again. "I never signed the final papers," he said, his voice dropping to a low, urgent rasp that cut through the silence of the room. He watched her eyes widen, the shock flickering across her face like a light catching glass. He let go of her shoulders, stepping back just enough to reach into the inner pocket of his coat. His movements were precise, deliberate. He pulled out a thick stack of documents, the edges slightly crumpled from the rain. He held them out, not as a plea, but as evidence. "The public announcement was a lie," he continued, his tone sharpening with a cold, calculated clarity. "It was a move to stabilize the board." He flipped through the pages, showing her the blank signature lines where his name should have been. The paper rustled, a dry, sharp sound. He looked at the empty space where his commitment belonged, then back at her, his expression hardening into a singular, focused resolve. The documents hit the wooden surface of the table with a heavy thud, sliding across the grain until they stopped near the edge. Minho did not look at them again. He turned his full attention back to her, his posture shifting from defensive to entirely open. He took a single step forward, closing the remaining gap between them. His voice rose, losing its previous sharp analytical edge and replacing it with a raw, resonant force that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "I did not come here to explain a contract," he shouted, the sound echoing off the cramped walls. "I came here because I chose us." The conviction in his tone was absolute, It was a declaration that cut through the lingering tension, stripping away the weight of the outside world. He stood tall, his hands balled into fists at his sides, his chest heaving with the effort of the admission. He watched her, waiting for the impact of his truth to land. The room felt smaller, tighter, as if the air itself was holding its breath to hear her response. He did not wait for her to speak. His hand went back into the deep pocket of his coat, the fabric heavy and saturated with rainwater. He pulled out a single, crisp envelope, its edges softened by the dampness of the storm. He held it out toward her, his fingers steady despite the tremor that had gripped him only moments before. This was not a negotiation. It was a severance. He tore the seal, the sound of paper ripping sharp and clean in the quiet apartment. He unfolded the document, his eyes locked onto hers as he smoothed the page against his palm. It was his formal resignation, drafted in the hours he had spent alone, waiting for the courage to act. He thrust the paper into her line of sight, the ink dark and permanent against the stark white surface. "This is the end of it," he said, his voice low and devoid of the cold authority that once defined him. "I have walked away from the board, from the firm, and from every expectation they ever placed on my shoulders." He let the document fall, watching it drift down to join the ashes. Alisha looked down at the paper resting near the ashes. Her breath hitched, catching in her throat as the reality of the document finally settled into her mind. She reached out, her fingers hovering for a second before they brushed the cold, damp surface of the resignation letter. It was real. The ink was not a bluff, and the signature at the bottom was a definitive end to the empire he had built. She looked up at him, searching his face for the cold, calculated CEO she had known for months. But he was gone. In his place stood a man who had stripped himself of everything to stand in this cramped, quiet room. The defensive wall she had spent weeks constructing around her heart began to fracture. She felt the tension drain from her shoulders, leaving her trembling in the sudden silence. The power dynamic that had governed every interaction they ever shared, the boardroom, the negotiations, the hidden dinners, had vanished. She took a ragged step toward him, her hands still clutching the paper, and for the first time, she stopped looking for the lie. The sacrifice was too absolute to be anything but the truth. They stood in the center of the small room, the space between them charged with the gravity of what had just occurred. The city of Seoul continued its relentless pace outside, but the sound of traffic and distant sirens seemed to lose its reach, muffled by the walls of the apartment. Alisha remained still, her feet rooted to the floorboards, while Minho held his position, his presence filling the narrow space. Every choice they had made over the past months, the meetings, the secrets, the departures, now converged into this singular, quiet moment. The weight of their decision pressed down on them, a physical pressure that made the air feel thick and difficult to draw into their lungs. There was no need for further explanation or defense. The silence was not empty. It was heavy with the consequences of their actions. They were no longer the people who had walked through the boardroom doors or navigated the expectations of their respective worlds. The world outside remained indifferent to their struggle, but within these four walls, the only thing that mattered was the choice they had made. The silence in the room deepened, becoming a physical force that pressed against their skin. Every breath Alisha took felt labored, as if the oxygen in the apartment were being slowly replaced. Minho stood only a few feet away, his gaze fixed on her, searching for a sign of acceptance. He raised a hand, his fingers twitching as if to bridge the final gap between them, but he stopped mid-motion. The hesitation hung in the air, a sharp reminder of how fragile their new reality truly was. Outside, the world continued to spin, but here, time seemed to have stalled entirely. The outcome of this singular moment balanced on a knife edge. If she turned away, the bridge he had burned would be for nothing. They remained suspended in that narrow space, two people waiting for the world to catch up to the choice they had made. The fragile peace inside the apartment shattered when a siren wailed in the distance, cutting through the heavy air. It was not just a sound, it was a reminder of the machinery currently in motion to find them. The city of Seoul was not merely a backdrop, it was a vast, interconnected web of surveillance and influence that had already begun to tighten its grip. Minho shifted his weight, his eyes darting toward the window as if he could see the search parties forming in the streets below. Every flicker of light from passing cars against the blinds felt like an interrogation. They were no longer hidden in a private sanctuary. They were targets. The walls of the apartment, once a shield, now felt like a cage. Outside, the corporate machine was already churning. The scandal of his disappearance would be the headline by morning, and the resources of his firm would be deployed to track his every movement. They stood in the center of the room, listening to the city pulse with a predatory rhythm that promised to tear their new reality apart. Alisha did not look at the door. She looked at him. She studied the line of his jaw and the way his hands gripped the edge of the table, searching for the slightest tremor of regret. The resignation letter lay between them, a piece of paper that promised freedom, yet she felt a cold knot of dread tighten in her stomach. Was this a genuine shift, or merely the desperate impulse of a man who had never been told no? She watched his eyes. They were fixed on the window, scanning the darkness with a sharp, analytical intensity that felt more like a CEO calculating a loss than a man starting a new life. Every time he shifted his weight, she saw the ghost of his old world clinging to him. The doubt was a physical weight, heavier than the threat of the city outside. She wanted to believe the words he had spoken, but the precision in his posture suggested a man who was still playing a strategy. If he faltered now, she would be the one left in the wreckage. The silence in the room deepened, becoming a physical presence that pushed against their chests. Minho finally turned his head, his gaze locking onto hers with a sudden, raw intensity that bypassed all previous calculations. Outside, a heavy thud echoed from the hallway. Someone had reached their floor. The sound was a sharp, jagged interruption that froze the air between them. They did not look toward the door. They remained fixed on each other, the space between them shrinking as the reality of their situation crystallized. Every muscle in Alisha's body went rigid, her fingers curling into her palms as she braced for the inevitable. Minho's breathing slowed, his chest rising and falling with a deliberate, rhythmic control that mirrored her own. They were standing on the precipice of a choice. The air in the apartment grew thin, charged with the static of 1,000 unsaid things. They took a final, collective breath, holding it in the hollow of their lungs. In that suspended second, the world outside ceased to exist. There was only the sound of their hearts beating in unison, a steady, frantic rhythm. The silence did not end with a shout, but with a tremor. Alisha felt the floorboard shift under her weight as her knees buckled. The air in the room seemed to lose its density, leaving her gasping for a breath that would not come. Minho moved, his hand extending toward her, fingers hovering just inches from her shoulder. He did not touch her, yet the proximity was enough to snap the final thread of her control. A sharp, jagged sound tore from her throat. It was a physical release, a sudden, violent expulsion of air that left her shaking. The tears she had fought to suppress finally spilled over. She stopped trying to maintain the distance. She stopped trying to hold the wall of logic she had built around her. Her shoulders slumped, her head dropped, and the entire weight of the last few months collapsed into the space between them. She was simply a person breaking apart. Minho stepped into that space, his presence grounding her as the last of her defenses dissolved. The room grew quiet again, the only sound the ragged rhythm of their breathing. Alisha wiped her face, her skin raw, and looked up. Minho remained close, his hand resting firmly on her arm, a steady point of contact in the shifting dark. He did not offer empty promises. He simply held his ground, his presence filling the space where her certainty had once been. They stood together in the center of the apartment, the weight of their decisions settling into the floorboards. Outside, the city lights flickered against the window, a reminder of the world they were about to challenge. Alisha stepped back, her movements deliberate, and reached for the door handle. Her fingers found the cold metal, a sharp contrast to the heat of the room. Minho moved to her side, his shoulder brushing hers, a silent affirmation of the path they had chosen. They had no map for what came next, only the knowledge that they were no longer walking alone. She turned the lock. The mechanism clicked, a final sound that signaled the end of their retreat. The hallway light flickered, casting long, erratic shadows against the peeling wallpaper. Alisha stepped out first, the cool air of the corridor hitting her skin like a warning. Behind her, Minho pulled the door shut. The click of the latch echoed through the narrow space, a definitive sound that closed the chapter on their isolation. They stood for a heartbeat in the dim, stale air, listening to the muffled hum of the city rising from the streets below. Minho reached out, his fingers interlacing with hers, a firm, grounding grip that anchored them against the sudden rush of reality. They began to walk, their footsteps rhythmic and steady. At the top of the stairwell, they stopped. Below them, the building was silent, but beyond the heavy glass doors at the base, the city waited. Alisha took a breath, her chest rising and falling with a new, quiet strength. Together, they descended into the dark. The heavy glass doors swung open, releasing them into the humid night. Seoul did not pause for their arrival. Neon signs bled color onto the wet pavement, and the roar of traffic swallowed the silence of the stairwell. Alisha felt the spray of rain against her face, a sharp, cold reality that washed away the last traces of her hesitation. Minho kept his pace matched to hers, his eyes scanning the crowded sidewalk. They were no longer hidden. They walked with a deliberate, synchronized stride that defied the expectations of their past lives. At the corner of the busy intersection, they stopped. A sea of people flowed around them, oblivious to the choice that had just upended two powerful worlds. Alisha looked at the skyline. Minho stepped off the curb, his hand still locked with hers, pulling her into the rhythm of the moving crowd. They disappeared into the blur of lights and motion, two figures against the current, finally moving toward a future they had claimed for themselves. The rhythm of the city intensified as they pushed deeper into the heart of the district. Commuters surged past them in a relentless tide, forcing Alisha and Minho to stay close, their shoulders brushing with every step. The air grew thick with the scent of street food and exhaust, a sensory overload that masked their presence from the prying eyes of the elite. At a narrow alleyway, a group of people stopped abruptly, blocking their path. Minho steered her toward a side street, his movements sharp and calculated. Words were unnecessary when the path forward was defined by every stride they took together. They climbed a set of concrete stairs leading to a pedestrian bridge, the metal railing cold beneath their palms. From this height, the city sprawled out in a vast, glittering web of light and shadow. Alisha leaned against the bridge, her breathing finally slowing. She looked at the horizon, where the lights of the city met the dark sky. They turned away from the view, walking together into the night, leaving the old world to fade into the distance. The neon glow of the central district began to dim as they reached the quieter residential outskirts. The roar of the city softened into a low, distant hum, leaving them in the relative stillness of the night. Alisha stopped near a darkened storefront, her lungs burning from the long walk. She leaned against the brick wall, the rough texture grounding her, and watched the streetlights flicker above. Minho stood a few paces away, his gaze fixed on the path ahead, his posture shedding the rigid tension of his former life. They had left the boardrooms and the scandals behind, but the silence between them now held a different weight. They stepped into the shadows of the residential lanes, their silhouettes merging with the darkness. They were no longer running from the past. They were walking toward a future that belonged entirely to them. The pavement gave way to gravel, then to the soft, uneven earth of the city's edge. The last of the streetlights stood behind them, casting long, fading beams that failed to reach the path ahead. Alisha stumbled on a loose stone, her footing failing for a heartbeat, but Minho caught her arm, his grip firm and steady. They stood for a moment in the dark, the wind carrying the scent of damp soil and pine from the hills beyond. The transition was complete. The city was no longer a cage or a destination, but a distant memory dissolving into the horizon. They moved forward, the ground rising beneath their feet as they climbed toward the ridge. The air grew colder, crisp, and sharp. Every step was a deliberate act of will, a rejection of the world that had tried to define them. They reached the crest of the hill and stopped, looking out over the vast, dark expanse of the valley. The summit offered a panoramic view of the valley, cloaked in the deep velvet of midnight. Below, the world was a void, devoid of the noise and demands that had once dictated their every move. Alisha stood at the edge, her breath hitching in the crisp air as she looked down at the path winding into the darkness. Minho stood beside her, his presence a steady anchor in the vast open space. They lingered there, the silence of the wilderness wrapping around them like a shroud. It was the first time in months that the air felt light, stripped of the pressure of corporate boardrooms and public scrutiny. A sudden gust of wind swept across the ridge, rustling the dry grass and pulling at their hair, a cold reminder of the reality they had chosen. They turned away from the distant, fading glow of the city, their backs to the life they had discarded. The descent began, slow and measured, their boots crunching against the loose shale. Every step took them further from the reach of their former identities. The valley floor was flat and covered in tall, dry grass that whispered against their legs as they walked. Ahead, the silhouette of a small, stone structure emerged from the gloom, its roof partially collapsed, but its walls standing firm. They approached it cautiously, the space inside protected from the biting wind. Min-ho pushed the heavy wooden door, which groaned on rusted hinges. Inside, the air was still and smelled of dry earth and ancient stone. It was a place untouched by the frantic pace of the city. Alisha walked to the center of the room, her boots clicking on the uneven floor. She looked at Min-ho, who set his pack down and leaned against the wall. They had crossed the threshold of a new existence, leaving behind the weight of titles and expectations. They sat on the floor. Outside, the stars began to pierce the darkness above the ridge. They were no longer the people who had stood in that sterile office. They were simply two people, breathing in the cold, clear air, finally owning the space they occupied. The war was over. Here, they began again. The firelight from their small lantern flickered against the rough stone walls, casting long, dancing shadows that stretched into the corners of the room. Outside, the vast silence of the valley remained unbroken, a stark contrast to the relentless noise they had left behind. Alisha reached out, her fingers brushing against the cold, uneven surface of the stone, grounding herself in the reality of their sanctuary. Min-ho watched her, his expression settled into a calm that had been impossible to find in the city. They did not speak of the firm, the scandal, or the life that had once demanded their total submission. Those things were ghosts now. They shared a simple meal, the act of eating a quiet, rhythmic affirmation of their survival. When the lantern finally sputtered and died, the room plunged into a deep velvet blackness. They lay down on the hard ground, side by side. There was no fear in the dark, only the weight of their own presence. The war was over. They were finally, completely, their own. Morning arrived as a thin, pale line of light tracing the jagged edge of the mountain ridge. The cold air inside the stone shelter sharpened, pulling them from their sleep. Alisha stood first, her movements deliberate, testing the strength of the floor beneath her feet. She pushed the heavy door open, and the morning sun flooded the space, turning the dust motes into tiny drifting sparks. Min-ho joined her, his eyes scanning the vast, empty expanse of the valley. There was no sound of engines, no hum of city electricity, only the distant, rhythmic rush of a hidden stream. They stepped over the threshold, leaving the shelter and the last remnants of their former lives behind. The ground under their boots was firm, damp with dew, and smelled of wet earth and pine. They walked toward the center of the valley, their pace steady and synchronized. Every step took them further from the world of contracts and scandal. They did not look back. The horizon was wide, open, and entirely theirs to define. They reached the edge of the stream, stopped, and looked at each other. No words were needed. The path ahead was unmapped, but for the first time, the choice was theirs alone. They turned and kept walking, disappearing into the morning mist. The ridge offered a vantage point over the entire basin. Below, the valley stretched out in shades of green and gold, untouched by the reach of the city they had abandoned. Alisha stopped and placed her hand on a jagged rock, feeling the solid, unyielding texture beneath her palm. Min-ho stood beside her, his gaze sweeping the horizon where the sky met the earth in a clean, unbroken line. There were no sirens, no flashing lights, and no shadows of the life that had once dictated their every move. The silence here was heavy, not with tension, but with the profound weight of autonomy. They watched a hawk circle high above, its path erratic and free. Alisha turned to look back at the trail they had climbed, but the path was already fading into the tall grass, reclaimed by the landscape. Min-ho reached out, his fingers interlacing with hers, a firm, grounding grip that anchored them to the present. They turned away from the ridge and descended into the basin, their figures growing smaller against the vastness of the terrain. They were finally, irrevocably, free. The basin opened into a wide, sun-drenched meadow where the grass swayed in long, rhythmic waves. They walked until the soles of their boots were worn and their breath came in steady, deep cycles. Alisha stopped near a cluster of wildflowers, the scent of crushed stems rising in the heat. She knelt, brushing her hand against the soil, feeling the pulse of a place that knew nothing of boardrooms or headlines. Min-ho stood a few paces away, his eyes fixed on the distant tree line. He took a long, slow breath, letting the stale memory of the city vanish from his lungs. There was no need for maps here. Every direction was a choice they made together. They stood in the center of the meadow, the vast sky stretching above them. The wind carried the sound of distant water, a steady, rhythmic hum that replaced the static of their former lives. The weight of expectations had dissolved, leaving only the reality of the ground beneath them. They were simply living, The woods provided a quiet sanctuary, the canopy filtering the sunlight into soft, dappled patterns on the forest floor. Alisha and Minho moved deeper into the trees, the ground yielding softly under their weight. They found a small clearing near a running stream, the water bubbling over smooth stones with a constant, soothing rhythm. Here, the air was cool and smelled of damp earth and pine needles. They sat on a fallen log, listening to the forest breathe. The transition was complete. The city, with its relentless demands and cold glass towers, felt like a story told in another lifetime. Alisha looked at the stream, watching the current carry away a fallen leaf, and felt the last remnants of her hesitation vanish. Minho leaned back, his hands resting on his knees, his posture relaxed for the first time in years. They had traded a world of paper contracts for the tangible reality of the present. There would be no more hiding, no more waiting for the next headline to dictate their fate. They were the architects of their own time now. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, they stood up, ready to move forward into the deepening dusk. The path ahead was theirs to define. Night began to settle over the trees, turning the vibrant green of the forest into deep, muted shades of charcoal and indigo. Alisha and Minho reached the edge of the dense growth, where the trees thinned out to reveal a vast, open landscape stretching toward the horizon. The air grew crisp, carrying the scent of distant rain and cooling stone. They stopped, their boots sinking slightly into the soft, mossy earth. There was no sound now but the steady rhythm of their own breathing. They looked out at the expanse, a space defined not by walls or expectations, but by the horizon itself. The path ahead was unmapped, a blank space, waiting for their next steps. They turned away from the forest and began to walk, their pace steady and deliberate. Every movement was a choice, every stride a rejection of the life they had abandoned. They moved into the darkness, not as fugitives, but as people claiming their own time. The world behind them was silent, its influence dissolved into the cooling air. Don't forget to subscribe for more. They reached the crest of the hill, paused for a final moment to look at the stars emerging above, and then continued forward. The story of their past had ended. The reality of their future had begun.